I look at my hands now, spotted with age and shaking with a tremor that has nothing to do with the cold, and I struggle to remember them as they were then. Strong, steady, stained permanently with the black grime of the factory floor. In 1943, grease wasn't just dirt. It was a second skin. It settled into the whorls of your fingertips and under your nails, a stubborn reminder of who you were and what you built. I was a creature of logic then. I believed in the sanctity of the combustion engine, in the holy trinity of intake, compression, and exhaust. An engine doesn't lie. If a piston misfires, there is a reason, a fouled plug, a blocked line. You can trace the fault, diagnose the symptom, and apply the cure. The world inside the engine block made sense. It was the world outside, the world of swastikas and shouting men and the nightly rain of fire from the sky. That had lost its mind. I remember the cellar workshop in Hamburg as a tomb that hadn't been sealed yet. It smelled of damp earth and sulfur, a heavy, metallic tang that coated the back of your throat. The only light came from a single bulb dangling from a frayed wire, swinging gently in the draft that leaked through the cracked foundation. It cast long, swinging shadows that danced against the brickwork, stretching and warping like ghosts trying to pull themselves free from the walls. I was tuning a small generator, a scavenged piece of junk intended to power a radio receiver for the group. My hands moved with a surgeon's precision, adjusting the carburetor screw by fractions of a millimeter. Listen to it. You had to listen. The rhythm was a heartbeat. If you could make it steady, you could pretend, just for a moment, that the rest of Germany wasn't rattling itself to pieces. But the silence was never real. Even down there, buried beneath the rubble of what used to be a bakery, you could feel the vibration of the city dying. The sirens were the worst. They didn't start with a sound. They started with a pressure in your ears, a drop in the air that signaled the coming wail. When they finally screamed, rising and falling in that mournful, mechanical agony, it felt like the sky itself was tearing open. But that night, the siren was distant, a dull ache on the horizon. The real terror was closer. It sat in the pit of my stomach, cold and heavy as a stone. It wasn't the bombs I feared. Death by fire is quick, or so they told us. It was the white rooms. The stories whispered in the canteen before the foremen walked by. The Gestapo headquarters at the Stadthaus. They said the walls in the basement cells were thick enough to swallow a scream whole. I didn't fear the pain, or at least I tried to convince myself of that. Pain is just a signal, like a grinding gear. What terrified me was the breaking. The idea that there was a point where Klaus Richter, the man who knew how to fix anything, would be dismantled. That they would find the loose screw, the weak weld in my soul, and twist it until I spilled the names of men I had sworn to protect. The fear of betrayal was a cold hand gripping my heart, squeezing until the rhythm faltered. The call came in silence. No trumpets, no patriotic speeches. Just a slip of paper passed to me by a woman whose name I never knew, tucked inside a hollowed-out bolt casing. I unfolded it under the flickering light. The paper was thin, almost translucent, the ink smudged. The orders were precise, written in the shorthand of the Besslein Jacob-Abschagen group. I stared at the paper until the words blurred. The shipyard, the belly of the beast. To sabotage the U-boat production was suicide. The security there had tightened since the last raid. The shadows were filled with eyes. My logic, the mechanic's mind that calculated risk and reward, screamed that the equation didn't balance. The probability of success was a fraction. The probability of capture was a certainty. I reached into the breast pocket of my overalls and pulled out the photograph. It was creased down the middle, the edges soft like felt. My wife, her hand resting on the shoulder of our son. They weren't smiling. Photography was a serious business, but their eyes were bright. I looked at them, and for a moment the damp cellar faded. I saw the kitchen table, the morning light hitting the dust motes. If I went tonight, I was forfeiting the right to ever sit at that table again. I was severing the line. The refusal rose in my throat, bitter and sharp. I could burn the notes. I could go back to the factory, keep my head down, turn the bolts, and pray the war ended before it consumed us all. I could survive. But then the bulb flickered. plunging the room into near darkness before buzzing back to life, and I saw the grease on my hands again. It was the same grease that lubricated the tanks rolling east, the same oil that fueled the submarines sinking ships in the Atlantic. I was part of the machine. As long as I worked, as long as I fixed what was broken so the Reich could break the world, I was complicit. The logic of the mechanic turned on me. You cannot fix a machine that is designed to murder. You can only strip the gears. My hands started to tremble. I watched them as if they belonged to someone else. The tremor started in the thumbs and worked its way up to the wrists. I clenched them into fists, forcing the bones to align, forcing the fear back into its box. It wasn't bravery. God, no. It was just gravity. The weight of what had to be done was heavier than the fear of what would happen. I packed my tools, a wrench, a heavy file, a canister of abrasive compound disguised as cleaning paste. They clinked softly as I slid them into the canvas roll. The sound was too loud in the quiet cellar. Every creak of the floorboards from the street above, a passing boot, a shifting timber made me freeze. My breath caught in my throat like a jagged piece of glass. I was a ghost haunting my own life, waiting for the exorcism. I tucked the photo back into my pocket, right against the beat of my heart. I didn't look at it again. To look was to hesitate, and to hesitate was to die. I nodded to the darkness where two others waited, shapes in the gloom, eyes reflecting the yellow bulb. We didn't speak. There was nothing to say that wouldn't sound like a lie. I walked to the cellar door and pushed it open. The smell of the river and the rain rushed in to meet us, washing away the smell of the oil. The street outside was a slick black ribbon, empty and waiting. I stepped out and the heavy door clicked shut behind me, sealing the ordinary world away forever. The rain in Hamburg has a way of soaking into your bones, chilling the marrow. Or perhaps that was just the adrenaline, turning my blood to ice water. We moved through the shadows of the docklands, 3 wraiths in the downpour. The shipyard loomed ahead, a sprawling city of steel skeletons and cranes that scratched the low, bruising clouds. This was my cathedral. I knew the Blohm and Voss yards better than I knew the lines of my own palm. I knew where the fences sagged, where the patrols grew lazy near the end of a shift, where the drainage pipes were wide enough for a man to crawl through if he didn't mind the rats. I was the guide, the mentor, but the wisdom I carried wasn't spiritual. It was structural. I knew that the ventilation shaft in Sector 4 bypassed the main guard post. I knew that the hydraulic presses in Hall 9 created enough vibration to mask the sound of footsteps. My pre-war life, the life of a dutiful worker, was now the weapon I held against them. It felt perverse, like using a healing salve to poison a wound. We crossed the threshold at the drainage grate. The metal was cold and slick with slime. We slipped inside, the air instantly changing from the fresh rain to the stagnant, oily atmosphere of the industrial cavern. The shipyard at night was a sleeping giant, breathing in hisses of steam and groans of settling metal. But it wasn't asleep. It was waiting. Everything I saw was familiar, yet twisted. The lathes where I had once watched men turn drive shafts were now shadowed altars to the war effort. The smell was the same, cutting fluid and ozone, but it sickened me now. We moved deeper, into the hull assembly hall. The ribs of a U-boat rose up around us, a whale made of iron, its belly open and hungry. I signaled for a halt. My companions, a burly dockworker named Heinrich and a boy, too young, surely only 18, whose name I think was Thomas, stopped. Thomas was vibrating. I could hear his breath hitching, a rapid, shallow sound that cut through the low hum of the distant generators. He was terrified. I wanted to put a hand on his shoulder to tell him to breathe, but I was the mechanic, not the father. I needed him to be a tool that functioned, not a boy who felt. The turbine housing, I whispered, the words barely forming on my lips. We need to unseat the primary bearing caps. When they fire it up for the test, the torque will tear the shaft right out of the casing. It was a cruel sabotage. It wouldn't just stop the machine. It would make the machine destroy itself violently. We crept forward. The floor was a grid of steel grating, looking down into the dark, cable-strewn bowels of the factory. I knelt by the massive turbine. the cold metal biting into my knees. I laid out the canvas roll. This was the test, not of strength but of nerve. My hands, which had shaken in the cellar, were steady now. The work grounded me. Lefty loosey. Torque specifications. The physics didn't care about the swastika on the wall. I had the wrench on the first bolt when it happened. It wasn't a shout. It wasn't a siren. It was a slip of sweaty fingers. Thomas, standing guard near the gantry railing, shifted his weight. He was holding a heavy pipe wrench, intended for the valve wheels. I didn't see it fall, but I heard it. The wrench struck the steel grating. The sound was absolute, a pure, ringing note of hardened steel on steel that seemed to expand, filling the cavernous hall, bouncing off the hull plates, echoing up to the skylights. It wasn't just a noise. It was a verdict. It hung in the air, vibrating, refusing to fade. For a second, the factory held its breath. The steam seemed to stop hissing. The generators seemed to pause. Then the world exploded. Halt! De Druben, the shout came from the catwalk above, followed by the heavy thud of boots on metal. Beams of light, harsh and blinding, swept down from the darkness, slicing through the gloom. One caught Thomas in its glare, freezing him like a rabbit on a road. "Run," I hissed, abandoning the bolt. But the boy was paralyzed. The logic of the flight response failed him. The first shot cracked, a dry, sharp sound that had no grandeur to it. It wasn't a thunderclap. It was the sound of a branch snapping. The bullet missed Thomas, sparking wildly off the steel hull of the submarine. But the ricochet physics again, cruel and impartial, sent the slug tumbling. It struck Thomas in the thigh. He didn't scream. He just folded, his leg collapsing under him as if the bone had turned to water. He hit the grating with a wet thud. The shipyard woke up. Alarms began to blare, a raucous, grinding clatter that drowned out thought. More lights flickered on, turning the shadows into jagged, hiding things. The air filled with the shouting of men and the terrifying, sporadic crack of rifle fire. I grabbed Heinrich, pulling him down. We scrambled toward the bulk of the turbine engine, the only cover in the open expanse. I looked back. Thomas was dragging himself across the grating, leaving a dark, glistening trail. He looked at me, his eyes wide and uncomprehending, his mouth opening in a silent plea. We reached him, dragging him behind the massive cast-iron housing of the turbine, just as the air where we had been standing was whipped by a hail of bullets. They pinged and whined off the machinery, sparks showering down on us like angry fireflies. We were pinned. To the left, the walkway was blocked by the converging beams of flashlights. To the right, the open drop into the dry dock. Behind us, the cold iron of the machine I had come to kill. In front of us, the Gestapo. I looked at the sabotage charge, the abrasive paste still in my hand. Useless. I looked at Thomas clutching his leg, the blood dark and oily in the gloom. I looked at Heinrich, who was gripping a pistol with white knuckles. The trap had snapped shut. The ordinary world was gone, and the rules of rust and iron were the only laws left. We were rats in the maze, and the cats were closing in. There was a service hatch beneath the massive turbine housing, a square of absolute darkness cut into the oil-stained floor. I kicked the latch. It gave way with a screech of rusted metal that sounded like a scream. We shoved Thomas down first. He didn't make a sound, just a sharp, wet intake of breath as he vanished into the sub-basement. Heinrich followed, his eyes wide, white discs of terror. I went last, pulling the heavy steel plate back into place just as the first flashlight beam swept over the spot where we had been crouching. We were in the gut of the shipyard now. The air here was thick, tasting of heavy grease, old water, and the metallic tang of ozone. Pipes hissed around us, carrying the high-pressure steam that powered the hammers and presses above. It was a labyrinth of rust and heat. We moved through the maintenance crawl spaces, dragging Thomas. His blood left a black, glistening trail on the concrete. We were slow, agonizingly slow. Every scrape of a boot, every labored breath echoed in the confined space. Above us, the boots hammered on the metal grating. They were organizing. I could hear the officers shouting orders. Efficient, methodical, a dragnet. They would flush the tunnels section by section, driving us toward the sea wall like rats. I stopped. Heinrich looked at me, his face a pale smear in the gloom. I told him to keep going. Take Thomas to the drainage outflow. I had to buy them time. I had to break the rhythm of the hunt. If I didn't act, we would be cornered in 10 minutes. I doubled back, moving against the flow of the pipes. I knew this system. I had helped install the auxiliary lines 3 years ago. I knew that if the main pressure regulator failed, the steam release would be catastrophic. It would be a wall of white noise and scalding heat, a curtain of chaos to hide behind. I reached the junction. The regulator was a brass wheel on a vertical pipe, glowing faintly in the dim service lights. But the path wasn't clear. A guard stood there. He was young, his uniform crisp, a stark contrast to the grime of the tunnels. He held a submachine gun, tapping it nervously against his thigh. He was waiting. I crouched behind a concrete support pillar. My hand closed around a heavy wrench left on a wooden pallet. It was a 40mm drop-forged steel spanner, a tool I had used 1,000 times to build. The fix to tighten bolts that held the world together. It was a tool of creation. Now, in my hand, it was just a dead weight, a lump of iron intended to destroy. I had to get close. I couldn't let him fire. One shot would bring the whole pack down on us. I stepped out. The mechanic in me vanished. The survivor took over. He turned. His eyes went wide. He started to raise the gun. I didn't think. I didn't feel brave. I lunged. I swung the wrench. Not like a soldier, but like a worker swinging a hammer at a stubborn rivet. I struck the gun, knocking it from his hands. It clattered into the dark, sliding across the concrete. He tackled me. We hit the floor hard. The breath left me in a rush. He was strong, fueled by panic. His hands were on my throat, squeezing. The world began to narrow into a tunnel of gray static. I could hear the hissing of the steam, louder and louder, mixing with the roar of blood in my ears. I groped blindly on the floor. My fingers brushed the cold steel of the wrench. I gripped it. I swung it upward blindly. A desperate arc. It connected with his shoulder. His grip loosened. I rolled him over. I pinned him against the hot metal of the pipe. He looked up at me. He was just a boy, terrified. I saw his mouth open to scream, to call for help, to bring death down on my friends. I raised the wrench. The heavy iron hovered in the humid air. This was the threshold. This was the end of Klaus, the worker. You don't break things. You fix them. But the machine was broken beyond repair. To save the parts that mattered, the operator had to be removed. I brought the wrench down. I didn't look at what was left. I reached up and spun the regulator wheel. I spun it until the threads stripped. The pipe groaned. The metal screamed as the pressure spiked past the red line. The explosion threw me across the corridor. A geyser of superheated steam erupted, filling the tunnel with a blinding, scalding fog. The alarms above were drowned out by the shrieking of the escaping gas. I ran through the white blindness, my lungs burning. I found the ventilation shaft we had marked on the blueprints months ago. I climbed, scraping my skin raw against the brickwork, climbing until I saw the stars. I collapsed on the roof of a warehouse, gasping in the cool, salty air. Below me, the shipyard was an inferno of noise and confusion. I waited for Heinrich. I waited for Thomas. I watched the drainage outflow for an hour. Then two. They never came. Maybe they made it. Maybe the steam bought them the seconds they needed. Or maybe I was the only ghost to crawl out of that machine. I couldn't go back to the flat. I couldn't go back to the factory. I was a saboteur now. A killer. My face would be on every list. The Gestapo would be waiting. 2 weeks later, I stood on a busy street corner in Altona. It was raining, a cold drizzle that soaked through my stolen coat. I saw her, my wife. She was holding our son's hand, waiting to cross the street. She looked thinner. There were dark circles under her eyes. She scanned the crowd, her gaze flitting from face to face, looking for the husband who hadn't come home. I stood 10 meters away. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. I wanted to run to her. I wanted to hold them. I wanted to tell her I was alive. But I knew the truth. I was radioactive. I was a carrier of death. If I stepped forward, if I smiled, if I let them see me, I would condemn them to the cellars I had just escaped. To protect them, I had to stay dead. The light changed. She tugged the boy's hand and they walked away. I watched them until they were just shapes in the gray drizzle. Then I turned up my collar and walked the other way. I died that day. The man who loved them died in the tunnel. Only the partisan remained. I sit here now, an old man on a bench overlooking the harbor. The cranes are new. The ships are massive steel islands, floating on a river that remembers nothing. The city is rebuilt. The brick and mortar cover the scars. The people walking by see a prosperous port, a free country. They see the sunshine on the water. They don't see the foundation. They don't see that this solid ground is built on a slurry of bone and impossible choices. They don't hear the silence that follows the explosion. I was a mechanic. I spent my life understanding how things worked. Lever and fulcrum, gear and piston. But the most important lesson wasn't about steel. It was about the soul. Freedom isn't natural. It doesn't just happen. It is a machine that must be built. And the fuel is the life you wanted to live. You pour your happiness into the tank so the engine can turn for someone else. I look at the water and I don't see victory. I see the empty chair at my son's wedding. I see the life I never got to hold. I see the face of the boy in the tunnel. We became ghosts so you could be real. That is the bargain. That is the price. This memory is a shard of glass I carry. Help me pull it out. Subscribe to keep this history alive.